welcome to Broadcasting Scotland's Full Scottish. I'm joined today by Mhairi Black MP, who is the MP for Paisley, Renfrewshire South, and also Murray Pittock, who's the Cultural Professor at Glasgow University. Welcome to you both, and thank you for joining us this morning. Obviously, one of the first topics we're going to be hitting, surprise, surprise, will be Brexit. big in the news again this week. And we saw that, previously Theresa May's deal had been voted down by a historic majority in Westminster, and then she decided to include everybody in her talks, but bizarrely Jeremy Corbyn refused to be involved in these talks unless no deal was taken off the table. Why did Theresa May survive the vote of no confidence after such a humiliating defeat, do you think, Mhairi?
I think, honestly, it's because of the failure on Jeremy Corbyn's part. That fundamentally, certainly from my perspective in Parliament, the problem is that both the Conservatives and Labour don't have a position on Brexit. We got that for, what was that, about 2 years? Brexit means Brexit, but nobody could tell us what that is, and that's ultimately what the problem is just now. Now, Corbyn messing about with the vote of no confidence before Christmas, had he called that vote immediately after she had lost the vote, the meaningful vote, then I imagine that we would have had a greater chance, because by that point the ERG and the Tories hadn't had time to do deals with each other. They hadn't had time to dish out knighthoods, for instance, and peerages. So all he did was give the Tories an extra month, and that's because fundamentally I don't think Jeremy Corbyn wants an election, because it's going to force him into actually having to come clean with what his position is on things.
Do you think, Murray, that the Tories are still there because they will band together and stay in power at all costs?
Well, of course, anyone will band together and stay in power at all costs. That's the purpose of the UK government, and the margins for error are very slight in a first-past-the-post system, especially one which is not bringing clear majorities to the fore, as hasn't been the case recently. So that's what you'd expect. But what the problem is that the alternative, the only alternative which appears to be an offer from the opposition, is having another general election. So there's a general election campaign where people choose between two pro-Brexit parties without a properly articulated position, as Mhairi says. So what kind of general election campaign is that? Single-issue general elections are bad enough at the worst of time, at the best of times, but it's not. This is the worst of times, and there's no articulate position to be had. So it's not surprising that that's happened. It's not surprising that, she survived that, but it's not surprising either that I understand Vince Cable has more or less said, Corbyn's not going to get his vote next time, because Corbyn's original plan was to keep having votes of no confidence so that he could avoid doing anything else, which I'm afraid seems to be really what he's been doing for the last 2.5 years.
Yeah. It's a dereliction of duty, really.
It's completely.
I mean, that's what's frustrating from our perspective, is because we're sitting there knowing that we have been arguing a reasonable position. We're not being radical with this. We're just saying, look, extend Article 50, which will give us more time to try and figure out something out for you to see sense. But we're limited in Westminster because Westminster comes down to a numbers game, and ultimately we can always be outvoted. So we're kind of, almost having to watch a car crash happening but not being able to do anything about it because Corbyn won't do anything.
No, I mean, that said, Yvette Cooper's amendment, which is the one which stands most like the chance of getting through, I mean, you will know the parliamentary debate now, that's what it looks like this week, does actually commit to extend Article 50. The interesting thing is that I suspect that it will have to cut across Tory tribalism, obviously, to get through, because the DUP aren't going to back it, I would have thought. So that will still make it very difficult for it to get through, and it's difficult to see. And there are a huge list of amendments, which of course Ian Blackford's is only one. It's difficult to see any of those amendments myself changing and carrying through the parliamentary arithmetic to the extent that actually this debate is resolved in the next 10 days. I mean, I'd be delighted if it was the case, Mhairi, but that's not, from a spectator's point of view, it doesn't look as if it is the case.
Yeah, definitely not.
And obviously, we're in uncharted territory, but do you feel that the Westminster processes and that whole arcane way it's run, do you think they're struggling? Do you think Westminster's struggling with how this is happening?
What's fascinating just now, if you ignore for a minute how horrific everything is, what's fascinating is, like I've always said, that I think that Westminster is not a functioning parliament. It is a club that masquerades as a parliament because its procedures are designed to make it difficult to challenge anything. But this is how big this crisis is, because for the first time ever, a light is being shone on that, and we're at this kind of deadlock almost. And it's just when I was listening to Murray describing, the last couple of months there, it's the first time as well that the theatrics of Parliament aren't enough, because all Westminster politics is just theatrics all the time till the next election, realistically. And what Corbyn's trying to do with this, continual votes of no confidence, that's the kind of theatrics that 2 years ago might have worked, but because we're actually in a crisis, that's not sufficing anymore. And with Yvette Cooper's amendment, I mean, even this morning I was watching Mar, and it's almost like they're talking as though she's came in at the last minute with some brilliant idea. We have been arguing for this for months. At months I've been in the room as we make the suggestion to both the Labour Party and to the Conservatives, and yet, it's only now that it's being listened to. So again, it's depressing and frustrating watching all this happen and knowing that you're kind of fighting it with one arm tied behind your back.
And you talked there about crisis, Mhairi, and obviously, day by day we see some of the cracks appearing in what potentially could be the impact of either some kind of deal or a no deal. And I think that the Dutch government reported this week that 250 companies had been in touch with them about relocating to the Netherlands, and then we saw the Guardian article about the Chamber of Commerce saying there's thousands of companies looking. I mean, obviously businesses have to look after business. That's that's their job. But do you think that we even know the full extent of what is going on behind the scenes?
No. Not at all. I think that when you actually list all of the incompetent scenarios that have happened, even in just the last 2 months, never mind, the last year, it is an embarrassing read. It's almost that there is no such thing as normal anymore. There is no ordinary, and because of that, we have seen that this government are nothing but evasive. They will do whatever twist and turn they have to avoid being straight with people. And the reason that they don't want to be straight with people, presumably, is because they've not got very good news. And I think that's what's really hitting home now, is that 2 years of non-negotiations have been left with, my God, we actually don't have a plan. We don't know what we're going to do next. I mean, when you seen the 100, in fact it wasn't even 100 lorries that were queued up at Dover, and it was a planned traffic jam to show the EU that, oh, right, okay. It's beyond a joke now, and we are sadly part of it.
And picking up on the embarrassing point, Murray, we discovered this week that ironically the BBC are going to need an EU-based licence for its international channels, so things like BBC World and BBC Earth, and they're looking for a new EU base. Obviously there's going to bound to be a cost to licence payers in this, but again it just shows the impact of Brexit and how ridiculous of a situation we've got ourselves into.
Of course. I mean, I think the abnormal has become normalised steadily and quite rapidly, really, over the last 2.5 year period. I was just saying before the programme started and discussing with Mhairi, that if you looked back at the Leave broadcasts, the Leave clips, the Leave adverts in the campaign, none of them suggested that this was normative. This was where things were going to end up. All of them tried to occupy, to some extent, the middle ground, the single market, incremental movement, all that kind of thing. Except perhaps for the Farage ones on the last weekend, which focused on the immigration issue. So we're really in a situation where extraordinary things have become normalised, but they've become normalised partly because they haven't been interrogated. And Mhairi spoke about theatrics. And I know, inside some of the major broadcasting outlets, there are very few Leave voters. And this created, if any, and this created a huge problem for them about how they would represent what was now a majority position UK-wide. And I think they've been flailing about to define it properly and to get a proper sense of balance in terms of enlisting the right, if there is a right kind of Leave voting outlook. And the result is that they have actually lost focus on where we are going and the risks about where we are going. And a classic example was yesterday the European Medicines Agency left, folded up its flags. That's 900 jobs gone. Coverage of that, discussion of that, outside social media, virtually zero. What is happening when major agencies close and there's not even a discussion about it? Because everything has become the theatrics, Leave versus Remain, and that's on the mainstream media as well as in Parliament. And that's been very unhealthy.
I think it goes back to Mhairi's point about the Brexit means Brexit. The whole media coverage seems to be based on sound bites, and that's all we get with no substance.
So are the campaigns. I mean, this has been my frustration with the issue of Brexit in particular, because from the very get-go it was a disingenuous conversation, because what has unfortunately come to light since then is this was a bandwagon for racists, for xenophobes, for people with horrible agendas, and they just used the right sound bites, to try and convince people of their argument. But because of that, we're not having a genuine discussion about Europe. And this is why I think, in particular, Jeremy Corbyn has been found out, because he's, I imagine, as a Brexiteer, that's the only conclusion I can reach by his actions. But I can understand people who do have legitimate problems with the EU. On the whole, the EU has been a successful project, but it's arguably not been successful for the likes of Greece or for Portugal. That you can look at it and say that big business always wins, that capital comes out as most important. I understand those arguments, but when you weigh that up against the situation that we are in and the costs involved with just outright coming out of that union, it doesn't justify it yet. And I think that genuine discussion has not taken place at any point in the last 2 years or since Brexit's even become a topic. It has instead become this disingenuous conversation all about immigration and a blue passport. It's ridiculous.
I mean, I think there's something to be said about referendums. I just wanted to put that out, put something out there, because there's an increasing orthodoxy that one of the things that's wrong with referendums, and we might be there in the future, who knows, is that narrow majorities are inherently divisive. So that actually this is a bad political system to have them, because they will divide whole communities and countries and so on. And that's been true particularly of Brexit. But one of the reasons it's true is that if you've got a narrow majority, you have to incorporate some of the views of the losers. And you have to be sensitive to them and get them in a big tent. And that happened with the Welsh devolution vote in 1997. It happened with the Quebec vote in 1995, and it happened all the way back to the Newfoundland vote in 1949, where accession to Canada was passed by only about 1%. So there isn't anything, and it's in a way happened also with Montenegro, which was about 55-45 in 2006. So there isn't actually anything inherently divisive about narrow referendum margins. What's divisive is the way that they're treated by the people who win. That's the real lesson.
Definitely.
You talked about Jeremy Corbyn there, Mhairi, and there was an interview with yourself this week, and you stated that that Jeremy Corbyn had been found out. Well, what did you mean by that? I
mean, just exactly what we've been talking about. I think that I, like many others, and I should say from the get-go that personally I have all the respect for the guy. He's had a very long career and he's been on the right side of most arguments. But what disappoints me, though, is that when he finally got to the position of power and authority, he pandered to everybody. And the whole reason that he was elected Labour leader was because he hadn't pandered all through his career, because for the 30 years as a backbencher, like I say, he had been on the right side of most things. And yet, when he gets the power in his hands, he's suddenly nowhere to be seen. And even with this Brexit issue, it was when he was saying we're going to wait for the right moment for a no confidence vote. I thought, no, you know that's not true. You're deliberately misleading people. And when you see people just, you know, what Jeremy says is gospel truth and that's it, that's where I think, no, you're having a dereliction of responsibility. That's you abusing your position now. You're just throwing out a line and hoping it'll stick. So I think he's been found out in this instance as not being what we all hoped he was. Basically,
I think that there's a train of thought out there that if in his motion for the no confidence of government, if he'd put in something about a people's vote, that might have swung it, and there might have been enough Tories to come over. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
I'm not sure it would have been enough to completely win it, because everything is so unpredictable just now in Parliament. I mean, even folk who've been there for 40 odd years are saying to me that they have no clue what's going to happen. But I think definitely he would have had a far better opportunity to do it immediately after she lost the vote, rather than wait over Christmas. That was just ludicrous to do that.
And so next week, obviously, you know, we've seen that Ian Blackford's put forward an amendment to basically stop the clock on Brexit, and Murray's already touched on Yvette Cooper's amendment, where she's looking to extend Article 50 if it looks like there's a no deal, and it seems that Labour are going to support her in this. What do you think's next, Mhairi? What are you expecting?
Well, at the moment, the most sensible option is, of course, to extend Article 50 through Yvette's amendment. But again, you're talking about logic and what's sensible in a building that is not designed on logic or what is sensible. So honestly, who knows? Because equally, there's so many different factions with so many different self-interest elements that it's unpredictable. You would have to be in every single meeting and every single corridor to fully understand what is going to happen next. But I do imagine that Article 50 should be extended, and I think that's the most reasonable.
And how is she going to persuade Conservatives to effectively back a Labour amendment against their own government?
Well, that's where I think there's enough backbenchers in the Tory party that realise that they're not getting anything else offered to them just now. So at most, right, okay, we'll extend it a bit and see what comes down the road. If I was a Tory, that's what I would be doing. But again, you don't know what the ERG's influence is, or even the Tory whipping machine. God, you don't know. It'll be in motion just now, so who knows what's going on behind the scenes.
Yeah. Earlier on, Murray, you touched on the European Medical Agency and the fact that they tweeted this week that they had lowered their 28 flags and symbolically said goodbye to the London office and thanked them for hosting since 1995. And you said yourself that it was surprising that, given the significance of this, there was nothing in the media. Do you think part of that issue is that if the media are not reporting what is happening in the facts, how are people, the ordinary man and women in the street, supposed to understand what the significance and the impact of this is going to be?
I agree with that. I agree with that entirely. I think that there's, of course, the media come under major pressure when there is a national crisis, and they're actually reporting this almost as if it's a war footing. But on the other hand, you know, some job losses in some places receive quite extensive coverage. And there's still job losses. People are still doing it. The jobs are still not there, and they've gone. And that's nearly 1,000 jobs. That's a very significant set of job losses. And it's just not worth touching because it is a European agency, and therefore it brings all that kind of sense of we've got to back the patriotic option and not point this out in its train. Well, I don't know what the editorial decisions were, but I can't imagine why you wouldn't cover this. But the point is, it's a symptom of something much wider, which is actually the beginning disconnect between European research funding and, of course, the university sector, but more broadly, the health sector, other sectors in the UK. There aren't, because there is no real agreement about anything, there's no real fundamental agreement about how access and engagement in European research networks will function after the 29th of March. This is fundamentally isolationist, and it's fundamentally destroying and endangering huge numbers of research partnerships and highly funded work, and yes, jobs. It's the desire to create the United Kingdom as an irrelevance is incompatible with the notion of global Britain, is what I would suggest. But many people seem to be unable to grasp this very clear implication.
And I think to highlight that, you yourself, I think, retweeted something earlier this week about the Golden Jubilee. They lost out on research that was scheduled to take part because of leaving, you know, the European Union. And again, it's just about these ripples that are happening all across the country, and it's not just Scotland; it's the whole of the UK. And you know, if it's not reported, then people aren't just going to understand where we're going to be.
So what's one of the major engines of global Britain, right? Is the British Council. The British Council, large part of their income derived from having the management fee for running Erasmus Plus, which is 4% of the total budget for Erasmus Plus, which is the student exchange and industrial placement scheme to the EU. That's now a huge hole in their budget. So the British Council, one of the major agencies of soft power from a UK perspective, have actually got a huge amount of chasing up to do to make up their budgets, because they actually depend on the EU for a large part of their budget indirectly. You know, it's that kind of complete lack of joined up thinking which is everywhere.
Yeah, yeah. And sticking with Westminster, not so much Brexit, but last week's programme we spoke about the other changes to pensions that was slipped under the radar last week, which is due in the 15th of May, which means couples with an age difference are going to lose out. And I know you've been heavily involved in the WASPI campaign, but this is going to be a double whammy for these WASPI women, isn't it?
Now I think we're on a quadruple, you know, choke slam to these women. It's appalling what they're doing, and you know, it's, you know, the way that we're looking at America and thinking there's so many horrible things happening, you don't know what one to focus on. Sadly, Britain has followed the exact same path, because while we could talk for the full hour about Brexit, things like this are happening. So now it's that people, if your partner is not of pensionable age yet, you're no longer entitled to pension credit. And that is going to just hit so many people, especially when you have an entire section of the society, women born in the 50s, who are already being told that they're going to have to wait an extra 6-7 years to get their pensions. So it's an unstable position, and it is going to have a dire effect on the lives of many. So I'm not looking forward to its implications whatsoever.
And I think the other danger is the rhetoric that's out there that kind of implies that a pension's a benefit.
But this has been a drip effect for years. And also this idea, the one that really gets under my skin, is the intergenerational war that they talk about. You know, why should young people have to, you know, have this huge tax burden on pensioners? Well, for a start, there are mothers, there are grandmothers, there are, you know, grandfathers. Stop talking about a section of society as though they're just a burden. And apart from anything else, this is the system. This is what we've designed as a society. This is what keeps us civilised. So yes, we're going to pay into it. If anything, when they keep changing the rules, what incentivises us to start paying for a pension? You know, why am I paying national insurance when I know that they can tweak the carpet out from underneath me at any point? So yeah, it's a horrible situation, and the longer that Westminster has control over pensions, the worse it's going to get, because they're trying to design it to a point where there won't be a state pension anymore. And there will probably come a time when there won't be a retirement age anymore. So as it's going back to Victorian times almost.
And obviously, you know, we've got an issue in Scotland in terms of life expectancy. Some people are already paying into a pension pot and never see that money returned.
When the government were doing their, you know, their research on this, trying to make the policy, we sat down and had a meeting and were saying, you know, stressing to the folk that, look, Scotland has a different scenario and exactly the point that you made. And at the time they seemed very receptive of that, appreciated it was fact and everything, and then completely ignored at the end. And you think, what is the point of this place if even when something is factual and you can say, look, this doesn't make sense, that they just plough ahead anyway and they get away with it? That's the bit that gets me. And I don't know whether it's, you know, part of that problem where Scotland's almost been beaten into submission over many years, but we've got to wake up at some point and realise that these impacts are going to start impacting your loved ones and yourself more than anything.
Because obviously we see a lot nowadays that, you know, young families are relying on retired parents to be looking after children and stuff, but if these retired parents are having to go to work, then you know, it's going to have a knock-on effect.
The number of women that I've met born in the 1950s who are literally on their hands and knees with arthritis doing a cleaning job because they literally have no other source of income. That's not right. That's not right. That's, you know, a 64-year-old is having to do that, 65. It's just, it's cruel at the moment, and I would say it's deliberate as well. This isn't they're not an accidental group that happen to have been caught up in changes. This is a deliberate thing. The government are aware of what they're doing to these women and they're choosing not to fix it.
To do it. Well, moving away from Brexit and Westminster, and obviously this week was Robert Burns' birthday, celebrated both at home and abroad. We talked before we come on air about just, you know, for the small amount of time that Robert Burns was actually on this earth, the incredible impact he'd had on. Were any of you guys involved in Burns stuff this week, or?
Well, I was certainly involved in quite a lot of Burns stuff this week because I'm doing this Scottish Government study on Burns, the Scottish economy. But I'm afraid work made me have to miss the two best suppers I was going to go to, including the one in Dublin where Fiona Hislop gave the immortal memory on Friday. But there are about 9.5 million people go to Burns suppers worldwide, and that's the official Burns suppers. So that is really a huge global market, if you like, and certainly a global resource for friendliness and engagement to Scotland. For many people, it's the only time they come across Scotland or any representation of Scotland in the society they're in. And actually, if you look at things like the Anhalt-Roper National Brands Index, the way people perceive Scotland is actually very closely linked to both the kind of things which Burns associated with humanitarianism, fairness. We might get Mhairi out of exercise there, but I said associated with, didn't say was, but also actually with the period that Burns comes from, the Romantic era. So people's attitudes towards Scotland are unsurprisingly out of date. But in many cases, they don't put Scotland in the top 20 for life sciences, by the way, for example, which it obviously is in all kinds of ways. But Burns is absolutely central to how people think about Scotland abroad. And I think we don't always maximise that as we could. I think obviously it would be useful to say a little bit about Keep Scotland the Brand here, since this is the week of the Great British Haggis. And of course the Prime Minister's very supportive message for Burns Night. But the interesting thing is that since national branding was very clearly linked to Scottish produce in 2000 and 2007 thereafter, the rate of export for Scottish produce, food and drink, has massively exceeded the rest of the UK, to the extent where obviously it's very clearly one of the three largest components of the Scottish economy. So that actually what we have to understand when we're talking about Scotland the Brand and the Great Britain campaign, not that those should be opposed to one another, they become opposed to one another because Scotland the Brand is thought of as a political competitor. It's not a political competitor, it's economic sense, because everything about contemporary food movements, provenance, interest in locality, the way in which you think about the locality itself and the way you think about Scotland is very important to a lot of consumers worldwide, and of course includes Burns. all of those things are actually part of what creates the market internationally. And there's absolutely no point in diluting it or getting rid of it, as in a recent poster in, was it Ottawa in Canada, promoting Irish whiskey, with an E, of course, under the Make Britain Great DEFRA campaign. So the importance about Burns is he's a Scottish icon, and the importance about Keep Scotland the brand, which is very much the fore in Burns Week, because Burns is a great consumer. Burns Night's a great consumer of Scottish produce. Is that it is also important and iconic for our national brand and our national economy, and must be supported.
You had any Burns?
No, I've got a Burns do up in Dundee on Friday, which is my first one, and I've got to give my first toast to the lasses. Okay. Or is it to the lads? This is what
You could give a toast to the lasses, I guess, or indeed a reply. I don't know which it is.
I'm doing a reply, I think, but this is what I mean. I don't know the ins and outs of Burns. You know, my experience of it is when I was wee, we used to have big family do's and things. But when I started to learn more about him in university, I'm kind of impartial. I can appreciate everything, you know, that Murray's saying about how he is, you know, a cultural icon. He is closely, very linked with Scotland and how we're viewed in the world and things. But fundamentally, he was a man, you know. So I don't know. I'm not, and I don't mean that as in there's something wrong. I mean, he was a human, you know. He was just a human being. His work I can appreciate, but I think, you know, certainly elements of private life were questionable at the best of times, and I wouldn't gloss over that just because the guy was talented. But yeah, I'm kind of, he's all right. Can appreciate the work.
Yeah, and we're just touching on what Murray said about the Keep Scotland the brand. Obviously, we saw the tweet from DEFRA this week, you know, claiming haggis as the Great Britain in the Union Jack and stuff. But, you know, obviously, you know, haggis, along with other stuff that Murray spoke about, is part of our heritage, our culture, our cuisine. Do you think this is just a sinister move to try and rebrand and water out?
I don't think anyone can deny that there has been subtle changes in the last, you know, certainly the last year. And what I imagine is this is just a constant drip effect. And we see it in politics all the time. It's just, you know, whether it be stop calling things social security and calling them benefits instead. You know, that's a deliberate move because it makes it sound like it's something that someone doesn't deserve. It's some lazy sort, you know.
It's a special bonus that I give you.
Yeah, basically.
Which I could take away because I'm just doing it because I'm kind.
Yep.
Yeah.
So the same way that language is very important in politics, so are these issues. So when we're seeing these things which are clearly very, very strong economical advantages for Scotland suddenly being brandished with a Union Jack, it does seem, why now? What's the purpose of that? And if you're claiming that there is no purpose to it, then why the change now? Or the reality is that maybe there is some thinking behind it. So we'll see where that goes, but I'm aware of it.
Yeah, and obviously this week, you know, talking about Scottish cuisine, we had the sad news about Andrew Fairley's passing, and he had a huge impact about putting Scotland and Scottish food on the map, both at home and internationally, and he will be a huge loss to ourselves, and obviously our thoughts are with his you know, family and friends too. In terms of Brexit shambles, and you know, no deal or some kid-on deal or whatever's going to happen, the bottom line is we're looking at some kind of devastation along the lines. So what for Scotland, Mhairi? Obviously you advocate independence. When is this going to happen? What's the process? What do you think it's going to look like?
Well, this is where I think we're at, again, a really interesting point and an unpredictable point in many ways. Independence, I'd take it tomorrow if I could, you know, much the same as most SNP people. But I think realistically we do have to wait till we see what the conclusion of Brexit is, because then, only then, will we know what we're dealing with. So I think that is a logical position. But the problem that comes next is that fundamentally Scotland doesn't have the legal power to do this. Now, we do have a mandate to hold it, but we don't have the legal authority. That's what this Section 30 order is. So fundamentally, for me, this is where a light is shone on why I believe in independence. And actually, the best way that I've heard it was in 2014 with Jim Sillars, when he said that on the 18th of September, between 7 AM and 10 PM, the Scottish people are sovereign. We are truly in control of what happens to our country. At 1 minute past 10, do we hand that power away or do we keep it? Now, we chose to hand that power away. Right now, we are now experiencing what the result of that is. This is what it's like not to be independent. You have to ask for something, and if the answer's no, then that leaves us in a position, well, what do we do? Because if we can't do the legal route, then surely it's the political route. And that's when fundamentally it comes down to what people are wanting. And I think what we're seeing, certainly over the course of the Brexit negotiations, has been almost an awakening with some people as to seeing just how ugly and arrogant Westminster is at times, and also how limited we are and how we are not in a partnership of equals under any shape or form.
What would you say, Mhairi, to the people that kind of argue that why does Scotland want to be independent but want to stay in the EU and be run by EU? What?
See, well, actually, how I start this is I say, see the Conservative Party, right? See if you were just to say one of their policies off the top of your head, just in a sentence, it sounds reasonable. You know, even something as horrific as, say, the 2-child cap limit, you know, well, people should only be having kids if they can afford it. That statement's bland enough for folk to go, yeah, okay, that makes sense. But the minute you actually think about real life and what that means and what that entails, and you go, oh my God, that's horrific, I don't know, that's not civil society at all. In many ways, that argument of the why do you want to be part of that union but not that one is kind of the same. On the surface, you're right, it seems like, oh, you've got me. But the minute you start to look into it, you see, well, actually, on the one hand, we have a successful European operation where, on the whole, it is equal. You do have a say in things, and you can participate, whereas in Westminster, you have a total unequal situation. And no matter what process or device we use, and no matter how reasonable we are, it doesn't get us anywhere. And that's the problem.
I mean, this is ultimately a pretty false question, I have to say, because the UK government for the last 3 years has variously been trying different ways for Germany to get it out of jail on the Brexit process, either before the referendum or afterwards. And Germany is a member of the EU, so presumably it's tyrannised over by Brussels. I mean, this is all taken through a very Brexiteer frame, the idea, why would you want one union rather than another, because one of them is a confederal alliance of states and the other isn't. But in terms of the any prospective referendum, I think there are a number of real significant problems, I'd have to say that. I think there is, as Mhairi said, the issue of the Section 30 order and the fact that it's fairly clear the Scottish Government aren't going to call an advisory referendum, not because it would have a similar outcome to the Catalonian advisory referendum, but because it would be too controversial and the margin is very small. So I don't quite see how this can be done before the 2021 Scottish elections. But I think there are significant problems even so. And I think one of the significant problems that has been there, and there hasn't been a lot of the work done on people's motivation, is the 35% plus of the SNP vote in 2015 who voted leave. Mm-hmm. Now that's a very significant group of people, and that doesn't include the fishing industry, which, by the way, you know, turns over in its entirety less than the University of Glasgow, even though it seems to be the only industry we have when the papers come reporting. And it's apart from being largely controlled and owned by a very small number of people, so that actually a very significant proportion of the SNP vote throughout Scotland are leavers, and this is a critical issue for any independence referendum, and is arguably just as critical as any of the economic or pensions arguments in the current environment and the environment of the next 5 years. And I'm frankly not sure that that has been tackled, or that it's actually, there's a very clear sense of where that issue lies and who are the people who are the SNP leavers. I mean, I know a few SNP leavers myself, but we need to get a much better sense of who this group are, and they go well beyond, you know, small towns in Murray.
And you touched on there about a Holyrood election, and again there's a train of thought there that perhaps we should be calling an early general Holyrood election, and you know, that would kick off the independence process. Do you think that's a possibility?
Anything's a possibility at this time. I mean, that's how I totally sympathise with what Nicola Sturgeon's saying, where she's going, we need to wait and see what the end result of Brexit is, because we have no clue what the end result will be, and whether we like it or not, the end result of Brexit will impact us, and it will impact our starting position, if you like, as to how we build the case for independence.
And I think just when you're talking about that, it's like, you know, timing is going to be crucial, and I wouldn't like to be that person that has to call that timing, because as you said yourself, it's so unsettling, it's so you can't predict anything, like we're just almost in limbo.
Basically.
Just touching on, Mhairi, something I think that was of interest to your own constituency. Obviously we had Santander announcing this week that they were having bank closures. Now that comes on the back of a whole load of other major banks that have closed and left areas without access to services. And obviously, apart from, you know, the urban areas, the rural places can be really affected by stuff like that. So it's things like, you know, their argument is we'll put an ATM in, but what you find is the ATM's empty, so they can't get access to cash. Or it's like, where does a business bank at the end of the day? Or you know, things like, again, they'll say they'll put mobile banking in there, but
you can't get a wheelchair in it.
Well, yeah, you can't get a wheelchair. I've known of some vans going round and round because they can't get parked or whatever. Have you had any dealings with the banks and trying to?
Well, yeah, we had, I mean, Bank of Scotland had a few closures. When was that? Technically 2 years ago now. I nearly said last year. But yeah, no, you're seeing this all over Scotland just now, and it is a combination of problems in that we are shifting to an online banking system on the whole, but we still have a responsibility, or as companies have a responsibility. So I think we need to start seeing more investment from them into making services that are actually appropriate for the areas that they're in, and making sure that they can serve all the people all the customers that are in that area. But that's, I think, unfortunately, we're quite some way away from that just now.
I think you can see the bank. I think you can see the bank's point of view, but there is an issue in that some parts of Scotland, I mean, Orkney is probably among the worst. Have got very, very slow download speeds, and in fact, online banking, even if people have got the technology, the money, the access, is actually very difficult to pursue successfully because the connectivity is not good enough, and that's true in quite a large amount of rural Scotland.
And I've also seen quite a few folk who, even when they go to the online banking, they end up making a mess of their own finances because they can't work the app or they can't work the internet. So it's something that companies have a real responsibility to, you know, get moving on it and make sure that if they are going to make these business decisions, then they have to put in place the mechanisms that will bring everybody with them. And if they can't do that, then they're letting their customers down, frankly.
And do you think there's a possibility of, you know, banks actually working together to some point? Like, if so, say for example, in the city of Glasgow, you could have umpteen banks within walking distance, but yet go somewhere a bit more a town, somewhere that there's no bank at all. Could we not work together and try and make sure that there's a broader availability?
A socialist plan for banks.
Well, do you think that would work? So another story, obviously, that broke this week was we saw Alex Salmond in court facing charges, and obviously it's not appropriate for us to be talking about an ongoing case and commenting on that. But I do wonder what your impression of the media's role is in terms of this and other high-profile cases. You know, this week we've saw a lot of journalists tweeting about not saying anything because it's contempt of court, but then they go and write a story and it's almost like, you know, a media trial. What do you think the media's role is in these kind of high-profile cases?
The media's role is, I have to say, to gain attention and to sell advertising space and to sell newspapers if that's still your antique thing. And so you have to expect them to, within the law, report as aggressively and as inflatedly about cases which they have judged to be of major public interest as they can. And so, I mean, I have to say that's what I think that has happened. And of course, there's a political element to this, which conflates with this particular case in a way that it doesn't with other high-profile cases. But I mean, in a sense, I'd have to be more personally relaxed about the way the media reports these high-profile cases than about the way the media reports Brexit, because they've always done this. They've always gone for if it bleeds, it leads, because they are customer-focused. When being customer-focused, they're bound to go for the market leader when it comes to criminal justice stories.
Yeah. And I think fundamentally, I mean, the media in an ideal world, their role would be to report facts, let people know what's happening. But I think fundamentally it's also a broader topic in that at the heart of this, there are people who feel that they have been victims of something. That has got to be the most important thing. And especially in the era of Me Too and Time's Up, where we are being forced to, you know, reflect and look at ourselves as a society to see how do these things happen and why are we allowing things to happen. I think that if we are truly taking that seriously, then now's the time where the media should show it, and they should show the utmost respect to the people that feel that they've been wronged and let the process play out.
Because that kind of sensationalism and headlines doesn't help anybody. You know, whether it's somebody who's on trial or somebody who is a victim, that kind of, and I think there's a tension there between what Murray said about selling papers and sensationalism and what is real life.
But
and
that's
real
also,
people.
but that's what I'm talking about. That us as a society, though, we have to reflect and go, well, why is it that newspapers are acting like that? Is it that we lap it up, or is it that there's got to be an element of responsibility as well, and going, look, what have we learned from the Harvey Weinsteins and from everything? How do we now start to behave differently? And that's where I think everybody just has to take a breath and go, right, let's let this play out.
The most effective way for this to become as responsible and as balanced and neutral as possible is for people to not take so much of an interest in it, but that's really completely aspirational. The truth of the matter is people often say one thing in public, but then they'll go and avidly devour the red top in private.
Yeah. It's a difficult situation for all that's involved. And obviously, actually today is Holocaust Memorial Day, and that's obviously there to mark the liberation of Auschwitz and remembering the millions who were killed by the Nazis, but also subsequent genocides like Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, and I know Parliament takes a big role in trying to highlight stuff like that. But actually, it seems more than ever we need to be remembering this the global context that we're living in now. And again, it goes back to we seem to be in such an uncertain way, and we don't seem to learn from our past in a positive way.
Well, that's the thing. On Thursday, was it? I signed the Holocaust Memorial book in Parliament. And after I was sitting in the chamber and I was thinking that, we do this every year where we have Holocaust Memorial, and everyone's very reserved and, solemn, as they should be. But there are people in that building who clearly don't appreciate what the day is about, because the whole point is to remember what led up to making this horrendous, horrific, shameful situation. And how can we ensure that we never end up there again? And when you see some of the interviews that politicians have been given, the rhetoric that they've been using, you think we have not learned a thing from that, and I think there's a lot of people who are quite hypocritical in that sense. You know, they're all reverend and polite about, you know, the Holocaust, but they can't see how their own rhetoric is, you know, stirring the same kind of hate that was alive and well during the Holocaust.
I think it's a real paradox. The Holocaust has become a central part of European public memory, but because it's public memory, it has become part of the establishment routine. And what's really disturbing is not only a rising tide of anti-Semitic attacks, widespread anti-Semitic commentary, and general xenophobia and worse being expressed by individuals across different societies in Western Europe, but not least in the UK, that actually it doesn't clearly, I've noticed that it's teaching in the school curriculum apparently, have the force that people imagine it's got. And so something is not working with telling people about the Holocaust again and again and again. Something's not working. And that's really worrying. I mean, you know, Germany in the 1930s was in a terrible state, and they were very vulnerable to the appeal of the Nazis, given the unemployment rates, the recent history of hyperinflation, the economy on the floor. But actually, relatively minor, and it is minor by comparison to the early 30s, economic crises in Europe have led to a resurgence of very similar politics or familiar politics on a much less of an infrastructure of economic disaster and meltdown than was the case in the early 30s. So it really does appear as if we're not going forwards at all.
And in terms of, I mean, obviously there's some links there to that whole Brexit rhetoric and you know, this immigration thing, and then we've got yellow vests, and then we've got, you know, politicians being almost attacked, whether it's verbally or physically. You know, you kind of begin to think, what are we doing here?
Well, it's the attacks on George Soros, which is the attacks which may be made by one of the EU's sovereign governments as basically an international Jewish financier conspiracy attack. It comes straight out of the playbook from the early part of the 20th century. And it is repellent and entirely incompatible with remembering the Holocaust. And that's, you know, remembering is combating. You're not remembering it effectively unless you combat it now.
Yeah, definitely.
But do you think, and you picked up there, Murray, you know, you said that, you know, going over and over every year or whatever is not getting the message over. Is that because you normalise something so you almost dilute it? It's just as if, oh, that's just, we've ticked a box, we've done that thing.
It was when Murray actually said there, it's become part of the establishment routine, and I thought that's exactly what it is. That going down to sign that book, you know, it is. It's you just go and get your picture, sign it, and leave your wee message and carry on, and that's you ticked your box for the day. And you can tell that there are lots of members who just do that rather than actually reflecting on what's this about. You know, so I do think that's a very accurate phrase.
Yeah, unfortunately. Moving on to we've got the teachers' dispute this week, and the EIS voted to reject the revised pay offer, but that now goes to a ballot for the teachers. On the surface, and for somebody who's not a teacher, it seemed like a fairly fair offer. Why do you think that was rejected, Mhairi?
Honestly, I don't know the details behind it, and I don't know the inner thinkings, but I think right now there's elements of politics being played. So I think it's best just to leave that one and see what the end result is. But there's also, it puts, again, the public and society in quite a difficult position when we're going, on the one hand, do you know what, quite right to be arguing for that, and at least they are arguing for better conditions. If you want that, then you start arguing for it. But there also has to be a recognition that we are not living in some bubble. We're affected by what's happening. We have been battered with austerity for years now, and that's going to be having an impact. We don't have control over the main economic levers within that, you know, that we need to be able to create the kind of world that we need. So, you know, there's principle and reality is kind of coming to a head there.
So no money tree then?
No, there is no money tree, funnily enough.
I think it would be instructive to publish the comparative scales in England,
Right.
And my understanding is, says a teacher in central kind of pay scale about 35,000 a year, that the current settlement would be about 12% better off than their counterparts south of the border. I mean, there are other ways of comparing this, and there are other comparators out there. What strikes me as remarkable is that a settlement which creates clear advantage to teachers who teach in Scotland actually is one which is completely unacceptable to the EIS leadership, and it's whether we'll see what the membership thinks, but it's very strange on the surface of it why that should be the case.
Yeah, well, we'll see what the members have to say. I don't know if you saw, Mhairi, this week the wee Ginger Doug spoke about the Battle of Glasgow's George Square.
Yes.
And we spoke about this in this programme before, about how sometimes we are not particularly aware of our own Scottish history and things that have happened. And obviously the story is in late January 1919 that there was striking workers that were rioting in George Square, and the British government were fearful of a communist revolt, so they sent the troops and tanks into the city. Do you think there's an element of deliberately trying to play down this story?
I think there always is. And it's funny, it's wee Ginger Doug that you bring up, because when I was talking to him this week, actually, I was saying to him that he was the one that changed my mind on a lot of things, because I, much like this in terms of history, but also in language with Gaelic, you know, I was struggling to find an answer to the argument, you know, less than 1% of the population speaks it, so why are we, you know, forking out money for signs and things? And it was when I was talking to him, he made it clear that that drip effect that I was talking about, that has been happening for centuries. And Gaelic is part of that. We have allowed it to be, you know, just slowly phased out. And I thought, do you know what, that is a fair point. And it's exactly the same with our own history. I've seen an article where it was talking about the Scottish clearances, the Highland clearances, and they were basically describing it that a lot of people just decided to go up and move and try and get a better life.
Opportunity.
And it does hit home that even when I was at school, I wasn't taught in depth about Scottish history. I knew nothing about our slave trade. I knew nothing about just how much the tobacco industry has paid for even in Glasgow. And I didn't know anything about even in depth the Jacobites and things like this. We have a strong history of democracy. We have a strong history of, you know, civil society and being a society that cares about folk, and also a society that, you know, when it finds its line, don't cross it. You know.
Yeah, I was going to say that, Murray, in terms of, do you think that, you know, the Scots appear to have in the past and now always stood up for injustice? We seem to have this kind of thing that we care about what happens to everybody, not just ourselves, and we're going to stand up for what's right, or what we perceive as right.
There's a long tradition of that, but there's a long tradition of not doing that as well. So I think, I think in a way it's part of modern Scotland's self-image that we are, you know, we are the nice ones, right? But I don't think that's always I don't think that is necessarily always the case, and I don't think it's always true. And I think the kind of treatment that Anna Sarwar has suffered over the last 12 months shows that it isn't really true. What you can say is that Scotland has been the place where a great many leading-edge, inclusive and progressive ideas have been developed over the centuries, and that we need our young people to get more exposure to their own past and their own literature and their own culture, because it's only by exposure when you're young that you learn to respect, embrace and internally own what you've got. And that is so important in terms of knowing your worth and the worth of the society you come from and inhabit now.
Because there's also an element where, because I was just about to say, I remember I did an essay at uni on this, on whether Scotland, when you actually look at social attitudes, there is no argument for it. We're no more uniquely, you know, split up into different groups than any other place. However, like you say, when you list the amount of, you know, whether it be inventions or whether it be movements or community groups that have been set up. We clearly, when we get it right, we get it right. You know, and I think that self-image that you were talking about, I think that is true. It is how we like to think of ourselves, but that's not necessarily a bad thing, because it means that that's what we're constantly striving for, and it's what we should be striving for.
Yeah, and there is more, I mean, there always has been for centuries more porosity between different social groups in Scotland than is the case necessarily in other societies. In that sense, you can see a clear similarity to the way social organisation in Scandinavia and Scotland has worked for the last 200 or 300 years. I mean, it's not a council of perfection, there'll be many things cutting across it, but nonetheless you can see a lot of it, an unusual amount of it, evident in the Scotland even of the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries.
Definitely knowing your history allows you to reflect and appreciate what's happening currently an awful lot better, definitely.
Well, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for, folks. I'd really like to thank Mhairi and Murray for coming in. It's been an interesting discussion this afternoon, and obviously like to thank the viewers at home for watching. Keep tuned this week, because obviously there's stuff happening down in Westminster that we'll be trying to keep an eye on and bringing you that news, and obviously we'll see you again next Sunday for the Full Scottish. Thank you.